Good morning and welcome everyone to our presentation on IEP goals. As it says on the slide, IEP goals are the roadmap from present levels to future accomplishments. And I just want to thank you all for making the time to be here today. I know everyone's lives are even crazier than usual this year, and I appreciate that you're all here. Just a little bit about Matrix as we start. You may already know that we work to empower families of children with special needs to understand and access the various systems that are there to serve them. We are supported by California and federal agencies and people like you. And please keep in mind that we're not attorneys and we're not advocates, but we're here to help you develop your advocacy skills. We can help you strategize for IEPs, problem solve school issues, and hopefully help and support everyone to have positive relationships with their IEP team. So who am I and who are you? My name is Erica. I'm a parent advisor at Matrix, and I've been at Matrix for almost 3 years now. As a parent advisor, I have the opportunity to talk with many parents and professionals, and I get to do the gratifying work of helping parents to connect with resources and to navigate systems for themselves and their children.
I'm Margaret, and I'm the Senior Parent Advisor at Matrix. I've been here about 9 years, which seems like a long time, but it's flown by. It's enjoyable work, and it's a great place to be. I joined Matrix when my children were having problems in school. I have 2 kids with ADHD, emotional disturbance, and some learning difficulties. And thankfully, they're both grown and out of the house now, so I have not had to deal with distance learning this year. And I sympathize and empathize with all of those of you who have had to deal with all that.
All right, so some of the things you'll leave here knowing, hopefully this will improve your understanding of how needs and present levels are related to goals, what a SMART goal is, and about tracking progress on goals. And for a little lighthearted moment, most ridiculous IEP goal ever. Susie will cross the street safely in 8 out of 10 opportunities. Uh-oh, what about those other 2 times? All right. Now, hopefully we can avoid goals like this by careful reading. This is our welcome to acronyms. Welcome to special education acronyms. Special education is based on a federal law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is also called IDEA. And there are 6 core principles of IDEA: assessment, the IEP, FAPE, which we'll go into, LRE, which stands for least restrictive environment, parent participation, and rights. To learn more about each of these principles, we have a training called IEP Basics, or you can read our packets. But today, to understand why goals are so important, we're going to go into the principle called FAPE, the principle of FAPE. So what is FAPE? We're going to take a few minutes to discuss this important aspect of special education: free, appropriate public education. Okay, so FAPE. Part of the IEP that you have probably heard if you're going to IEP meetings is the offer of FAPE. So FAPE stands for free, appropriate public education. So free means that the parent doesn't pay for it. That's usually not a problem. No one usually has a problem with that, at least parents. Appropriate, that's a little more tricky. What does appropriate mean? We'll talk more about that, but appropriate means that it will, to the extent feasible, given the child's abilities, allow them to access the public school curriculum. So the P, that stands for public. That means this applies to all public school systems, including public charter schools. And then the E for education. This means that it involves all aspects of what happens at school, more than just academics, the whole experience of school, but does not address challenges that the child or family has just within the home. An IEP, so the FAPE in the IEP means that there must be educational benefit to the student. And then we'll talk a little bit about what that means. Educational benefit, as it says here, to have educational benefit, the IEP program should improve educational results and functional outcomes. And this does not only mean academic success, as I mentioned. The purpose of education is really to give students the skills that they need to fully participate in the experience of school, and for after they leave school in order to fully participate in society and to live independently as possible. How can you see the results of the educational results and the functional outcomes? You can see these perhaps in passing grades, in the student advancing from grade level to grade level. You can see this in progress on IEP goals. You can see this perhaps on scores of statewide or district level assessments, and ultimately perhaps from graduation from high school. What is meant, precisely, or the definition of educational benefit is going to vary depending on the needs and the capabilities of the child. And there have been court decisions, including Supreme Court decisions, that have contributed to this definition of educational benefit. And the standard has been raised in recent years. We're going to talk a little bit about FAPE and educational benefit and a fairly recent court case. So a few years ago in 2017, there was a landmark case at the level of the Supreme Court called Andrew F. versus the Douglas County School District. And it asked this question: do schools have to provide a meaningful education in which children with disabilities show significant progress and are given substantially equal opportunities as children without disabilities, or can the school provide an education that results in just some improvement? The court decided in this case in favor of Andrew F., which elevated the need for quality goals. A school must offer an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. So this slide here has some highlights of the Andrew F. case, and you can read more about Andrew F. on a help sheet that we have that I believe was included in your email. If not, we're happy to help you find that. I'll read the last two bullet points here as I think they relate closely to IEP goals. School personnel need to have a responsive explanation for their decisions that shows the IEP is reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress appropriate in light of his circumstances. And to me, that means as a parent asking questions in an IEP meeting or about goals, that's I think the opportunity for that responsive explanation that is referred to there. And then the last one, school personnel will make decisions that are informed by their own expertise, the progress of the child's potential for growth, and the views of the child's parents. And to me, that speaks to the way that the goals are proposed, decided on, and supported in terms of the progress. So in a nutshell, the standard was raised from more than trivial to appropriately ambitious. And how do you know if the program is appropriately ambitious or that the IEP is going to enable the child to make that appropriately ambitious progress? Well, that is part of what goals are about. So we're going to talk a little bit about how goals fit into the IEP. As you probably know, your IEP document has a whole lot of pages and the IEP meeting covers many topics. So where exactly do goals fit in? We have a visual for this. This is there's a sequence that the IEP meeting follows, the IEP document follows, and there's a method to that. There's as is shown in this picture, if you start by looking at the bottom, assessments are the foundation of this pyramid. The next level of the pyramid is the goals. And then once goals are determined, services and then finally placement are considered. So there's this sequence that needs to be followed for the IEP to be written for educational benefit. And that sequence is important to understand so that you know the order in which different aspects of the IEP are discussed and how you can determine whether the whole IEP adds up to educational benefit is this whole process. So as I said, assessment is the foundation of the process which determines needs and describes the present levels of academic and functional performance. And then the annual goals written to address those needs that were determined in the assessment, the special considerations, services, accommodations, modifications, that's provided so that the student can make progress on their goals. And then placement is considered last. This is the determination of where the situation will be, what is required for those services to be provided to the student. And yeah, I think we are ready for the next slide then, and your part here, Margaret.
Okay, so we talked about assessment being the basis for the whole process of developing an IEP. You need good information on which to determine that what the child needs. And we're going to talk a little bit more about assessments, because assessments, you think of assessment generally as the big review that's done once every 3 years, first of all, to identify whether the child is actually eligible and what category of disability they fit into. And that's done once every 3 years, usually. There are reasons that assessment might be done at other times, but that's the general practice. And we need to emphasize that assessment is not just the testing that the school psychologist and the resource teacher do. It also includes the parent's observation. That's a very important and valuable part of the assessment. So in addition to the diagnostic tests the school does, work samples, and you might want to keep work samples from your child because if you think that you're seeing something that the school doesn't see, if you can show that through your observations and work samples that you've collected, that can be important. There are other things like behavior logs, attendance records, report cards, disciplinary records. All of these things go into making up what an assessment is. And altogether, this creates a picture of the child and the child's needs. You have this assessment, you've done all this testing, put together all these observations, and what do you find? There are a lot of different needs that your child has. Seldom will your child just have one issue. You could have many needs, and part of the process you go through in figuring out what goals to have is prioritizing the child's needs. If your child has 15 or 20 different needs, that makes it a difficult process if you don't think about what is most important. So we have a toolkit, and this is available on our webpage, and it's set up to help you identify and prioritize needs and then move to what kind of goals you might develop based on that. And I would just say that it's really not the parent's job to write goals. It's the school's job, the IEP team as a whole, writing the goals. But you need to understand what kind of goals there should be, how a good goal is written, and to be able to evaluate whether you think the goals that are in your child's IEP are the appropriate ones and whether they're well written and meaningful. So using our toolkit, uh, you can help organize and prioritize the needs and then transfer those into development of SMART goals. And the toolkit can be found on our website. This should be a good link in the PDF that you get of this presentation. Um, if you have any trouble finding it, let us know. There should have been a link to this in the registration link, but as I think I mentioned earlier, I was told just this morning that perhaps that didn't go out, and you might get an updated email from us with that link in it. So we welcome you to download that and work with that. And if you have any problems doing that, don't hesitate to call us and we can walk you through it. So yes, your child may have many needs, and every significant need should be addressed in the IEP by an accommodation, a modification, or by a goal. So what are the most important needs? This is a judgment call. Uh, it's something that you think about, teachers think about, and this really requires some discussion because you may not agree. What you're seeing and what the teacher's seeing may not be exactly the same. So it will take some collaboration to really agree on what are the most important needs and what really needs to be addressed in the IEP. So think about this before you go into an IEP meeting. It's good to have your list written down and put in some kind of order so that you know what your thoughts are before you enter the meeting, so you don't get confused and forget what you were going to say or forget something that you thought was important. But you also want to listen to what the other team members say and be willing to be flexible and think about what they're saying if it's not quite what you see as the priority list. So within this toolkit, we do have this worksheet that you can fill in. It shows what strengths and weaknesses might be. And again, this is to put down needs primarily, but you also want to note what strengths your child has. The idea is to lean on the strengths to help overcome and deal with areas of weakness. So identifying strengths as well as weaknesses is important. So this is an example of the worksheet, and I just filled in with just some ideas of what you might, the sorts of things you might put into this worksheet. For example, in the area of language strength, my child is very verbal and can speak up in class. That's something not all kids do, right? So if that's something that your child does, that's a strength. What's the concern? Well, she doesn't really understand directions. She listens, but she can't really figure out what the teacher is telling her to do, and therefore she doesn't complete her assignments. What do you hope will happen? Well, I hope she learns to copy her homework assignments from the board to a planner so that when she comes home, we know what the assignments are and I can help her with her homework. So you might go through a number of things like this. This is just an example. It's just sort of a made up example, but this is the sort of idea. You list the things that are strengths, list the things that are needs or concerns, and then prioritize which is the most important to you and which is the least important. And you just go through this process so you have a picture in your mind of what needs to be addressed by goals in the IEP. So now we need to talk, before we get to actually writing goals, we need to talk about present levels of performance. And there's actually a longer term here, present levels of academic performance and functional I can't remember exactly what it says, but we always shorten this to present levels of performance. This will be about the second page in your IEP, or maybe the third, where there's a title at the top of the page that refers to present levels. Present levels are statements describing what your child currently can do, what they can do right now. And these present levels should come from the assessments or from additional tests and assessments that the teacher may have done in class, the less formal ones. It might be as a result of some of the standardized testing that's done. But in any case, any information that's available that describes what your child can do at the current moment, that is what the present level is. They're not all just from test scores, but they are descriptions. And here are some of the areas that should be addressed by present levels: communication, health, academic or pre-academic and functional skills, motor skills, psychological, such as emotional and behavioral, social, and vocational. So we have this acronym CHAMPS, but then we have to add the V at the end for vocational, if that's important for your child. So how do you know if the present levels of performance are appropriate as spelled out in the IEP? They should be well written and clear. They should address every significant need the IEP team agrees upon and for which a goal exists or for which a goal will be written. And because they are the baseline, they're the starting point to compare progress towards achieving new goals. So you can't set a goal if you don't know where you are to begin with. So these present levels are the starting point, they're the baseline. And there should be something in every one of those categories I just mentioned. So I'm going to go back to that slide for a second. All of these areas should have something written down. Now, it might be that what's written down under one of these is this isn't a problem for this student, or there isn't any concern in this area. For example, if your child is a good athlete and has good handwriting, but their problems are in speech and language or social skills, then under motor, there might be a not applicable or not a concern for this student. But there needs to be indication that every single area was at least looked at by the IEP team and some determination made as to whether this is an area of concern. So then, things to check as you're going through an IEP. The present levels should match goals. Each goal should describe the same skill area as the corresponding present level statement. And we're going to go through some examples here. And then the measurement criteria should match. For example, if the present level is write assignments for all classes in plan book 2 out of 5 days, the goal is the same, but at a level showing growth. So from writing 2 out of 5 days to writing 4 out of 5 days. That's the same skill, but it's showing growth. So you're starting with the present level and showing improvement. Then another thing to check is, do the present levels reflect all important needs identified in the assessments? This is one reason you're going to want to read the assessments and put together other information you have about how your child is doing, so that you can see that every important need is addressed by a present level. And again, we've said this before, but present levels are the baseline for which goals are written. Another thing to check, if this is a transition to adulthood IEP, so this will only impact parents whose children are at least 14 years old. Um, transition plans have to be written for the IEP that is in effect when your child turns 16. So it won't affect everybody who's here, but just so you know, when you get to that point, there will be a transition plan at that point, and there should be transition assessments and vocational information that needs to be provided as part of the transition assessments. And therefore, there would also be goals written around that transition to adulthood and addressing vocational needs as well as academic needs. So, developing goals. You will see in your IEP document a form that looks like this. Um, it's a form that I think is pretty standard on all IEPs in California at this point. This comes from, I think it says state SELPA template. We actually got our forms from Sonoma County, but they should be pretty much all the same because most counties are now using the SACE database, and all these forms are in this database. All the teachers have it on their computer, and so you'll see this form for just about every goal that's developed in an IEP these days. So goals are the center of the IEP. This is where you make that determination of educational benefit. So we went over what does FAPE mean and what's educational benefit. You really need to focus on the goals to determine whether there is educational benefit coming from your child's IEP. If this is not your child's first IEP, if you've had an IEP last year, then you're going to have two sets of goals in the IEP. So from last year, you'll have a set of goals that were established at last year's IEP. And you'll see that there are progress reports at the bottom of this goal form. And so if they're last year's goals, all of these progress reports should be filled out, including the annual review with a statement as to whether the goal has been met. Now, you should have received progress reports all along during the year. So you should have seen what was in progress report 1, progress report 2, and progress report 3. But you won't have seen the annual review saying the goal has been met or not met until you go to the IEP meeting, and then that annual review should be filled in on the draft form that the school provides for you. One thing that's important to note is if the goal was not met, there should be an explanation. Why is that? What happened? And there's many reasons that it might not have been met. This is never the fault of the child. It's maybe the services weren't sufficient. Maybe the goal was too ambitious or inappropriate in some fashion. So there may be many reasons, but you need to understand if it was not met, why it was not met. And then it's important to note from last year's goals, what happens next year? So will there be another goal in the same area? How does it build upon this goal from the previous year? So you always need to look at these goals from the previous year before you start to develop goals for the coming year. And there should be some flow from one year to the next. There may be new goals in new subject areas if something different has come up, but it could well be that you have the same subject areas addressed year to year and you see a progression. And at this point, yes, for last year it would be blank. Excuse me, this will not be blank for last year's goals, but it will be blank for the coming year goals. And you check to see whether each goal has been met. there isn't any correct number of goals. It really depends on your student and your student's needs. I have seen IEPs with only one goal. That's pretty unusual and may mean that not enough thought has gone into what the student really needs. Um, I've never seen one with 50 goals, but I have not infrequently seen 25. So, it really just depends on what your uh, students' needs are. And the thing to note is that not every single skill is going to have a goal. For example, if your child has problems in math, you might have 1 to 4 or 5 math goals, but not every single different type of math problem is going to be addressed by a different goal. It's to indicate that progress is being made in this area. And if you have too many, it's going to be hard for the resource teacher to really work on achieving all these goals, or whatever therapist is, speech therapist, or whoever is working with your child. If you just have so many that, it's very hard to keep track of all of these goals, that can be a problem. The other thing to think about is the number of goals may have something to do with what placement is needed for your child. If there's a whole lot of goals, they're probably not going to spend all of their time in the general education curriculum with general ed students, because if there's many goals to be worked on, they need more time with specialist or special ed teachers in order to work on those goals. So do be aware of that. Um, and you may here, as we've talked about, you may need to prioritize to make sure it's the most important needs are being addressed. And then where possible and where appropriate, goals are to be aligned with the Common Core and state standards. So this helps focus the goals around key requirements for each grade. And I know people's eyes glaze over sometimes when we start talking about Common Core. You can Google these and find them online, and it is useful often to look at the Common Core standards, because it gives you an indication of what other students of your child's age and grade should be able to do. And so it does help you understand what your child would be doing if they were accessing the general curriculum in the general education classroom. And so that's the standard that is to be met if it is possible for your child to meet it. Um, Sometimes it's not, but that's always the goal that's set out there. Um, and another thing to be aware of is you can work on the goals before an IEP meeting. You can email back and forth with your child's teacher or therapist about things that you think ought to be in the goals prior to the meeting. They could send you drafts prior to the meeting. So some of this could be worked out in advance, but you can't actually formalize the goals until the IEP meeting is held. So what areas? We've talked about not just academic, but also functional. And so academic means things like reading, writing, math, organization. Many kids have executive functioning deficits and they need some organization skills, oral expression, listening, receptive language. Functional performance means the activities of daily living. So the IEP should address functioning in the school world as well as academic skills. Things like being able to work with other kids in a group, being able to participate in an assembly, um, as mentioned, coming to school dressed appropriately. These are things that are functional performance and can be addressed as goals in the IEP. Then there can be all sorts of other skills that may impact on the student accessing the curriculum, whether they are on track, whether they have appropriate behavior, appropriate social skills. Uh, so all of these things can be addressed in an IEP if they are impacting the child at school. Another thing to be really conscious of is that goals should build independence and not dependence. You're trying to make your child more independent as they grow and develop. Uh, so you don't want to have learned helplessness. You want the child to learn to do the skill independently. So maybe the first year, the child will write in their planner with teacher prompting and achieve a certain level of accuracy with teacher prompting. You would want the next year for there to be fewer prompts or to not use teacher prompts so that the child independently is able to demonstrate that skill. So now we get into, once you've decided what goals to have, how do you determine if your goals are SMART goals? And you've probably seen this acronym before. SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. Um, so you've probably seen similar or um, things like this as a SMART acronym. Sometimes slightly different words are used, but these are the important ones when it comes to IEP goals. So specific means that the goal should name the specific skill or subskill or subject areas that is targeted. Um, so if we're talking about math, are we talking about addition, subtraction, uh, calculation? Are we talking about word problems? Um, or if the child is a little bit older, are you talking about an algebraic function? Or, what is it that you're addressing specifically with this goal? Measurable means that you have to have a way of measuring whether progress is made. And measuring doesn't just mean the teacher's impression about whether progress is being made. There actually has to be some kind of data tracking. So need to know what you're measuring. It's not just a grade. It's not just an impression. And this is true even on things like behavior. Their behavior logs can be kept. If you have uh, behavior goals and you're trying to see a lessening of meltdowns by the child or shorter time meltdowns, they can keep behavior logs that will show real data and show whether progress is actually being made, as well as in areas of academics where there may be actual quizzes and tests and other things that help measure whether progress is being made. Achievable, or also you could say attainable. This means that it's reasonably calculated, that it is possible for the child to attain this goal with the proper supports. There's no point in putting down something that it is not possible for the child to do. Uh, so, so just think about that when you're putting down goals. You want to have ambitious goals. You want this to be something that your child, with support, is reaching for, but not something that's impossible. Um, Relevant or realistic. Um, Not every possible area. Now, we said every significant need has to be addressed by a goal, but not every possible thing that you could include. So um, this has to be something that's relevant to your child, that's unique to your child. This is not just something that everybody in the class is doing. So it really has to be focused on what's important and relevant for your child. And then time limited. Um, Generally, an IEP goal in an IEP document is for 1 year's time. The goal is what you expect the child to be able to do 1 year from now. So if there are short-term benchmarks or objectives, as we noted, this is only for kids who are taking the California alternate assessments, not most kids. These are for the more severely impacted kids. would get the short-term benchmarks and objectives. But for the most part, these goals are going to be written for a 1-year time period. And just be aware that you're going to get progress reports. You should be aware of when you're getting progress reports so you can see during the course of that year whether progress is being made. So in summary, when you're reading the present level and the goal, can you form a specific picture in your mind of your child's actions, what they're doing or not doing, and what you expect them to be doing a year from now? Now we're going to stop for a minute and talk about some specific goals and see whether you think they fit that SMART criteria. As to that term carrier phrases, it says the student needs carrier phrases, and then the goal doesn't say anything about providing carrier phrases. So whether or not you know what it means, it says he needs them, but it doesn't say anything about how he will learn them or how they will be provided to him. So there's sort of a mismatch there. Again, another mismatch is the goal includes using picture cue cards, but there's nothing in the present level that addresses using those. So it's just a little bit of a mismatch here between the baseline and the goal. It's clearly in the same area. It's clearly still about expressive language, but there's just not a match of exactly what's in the baseline leading into what's in the goal. Another area of specificity, adding an example of what some carrier phrases are would help. It would also be useful to define what does using simple phrases to sentences mean. How long are the phrases to be? Is 4 words sufficient? Or 5 words? What is a complete sentence, or what would be sufficient as a phrase or a sentence?
I think that one of the points made about the previous one too, it can be the case that a goal meets the SMART requirements, but is still could be a better goal. So that's one thing to look for is the different aspects of a SMART goal. But then there are some bigger picture things that can be looked at as well.
It's a very ambitious goal for this child. If she's getting frustrated writing more than a couple of words, and now we're going to ask her to write 4-sentence paragraphs, that's a pretty big step and may not be considered attainable. And again, what does adult support mean? So that's sort of a vague phrase. You might want to define that a little bit more. And again, editing and expanding thoughts. How are we actually measuring those concepts? These things need to be defined a little bit more. And again, this is mixing more than one skill. Being able to find the right word and being able to spell, these are 2 different skills. It's quite possible that a student is very able to express themselves in words and can't spell. It's also possible for a student to be able to get 100% on their spelling test and not be able to write a coherent sentence. So it's sort of mixing 2 different sub-skill areas. Another thing to be aware of is this says it's about writing, but be aware that there's a behavioral component to it. And maybe there should be some additional goal on helping this child work through frustration. What is the skill for her to use to learn to continue to try to do something that's frustrating? And this may be something that is either a behaviorist or maybe even an OT might be working on with the child, as opposed to just the classroom teacher or the resource teacher.
So thoughts on this one? This is a little more straightforward.
Yeah, but this is the first question I would ask of the teacher who suggested this goal. What do you mean by the standard algorithm? Because I would not be sure.
And we have a comment that this does not tell what the student is struggling with. Yeah, it doesn't talk about why, what part of the situation is in this baseline description. What is at issue? And then we have another comment that it doesn't seem robust enough, which I would say that looking at the baseline being 70% accuracy and the goal within a year going up to 80% accuracy does not maybe seem ambitious enough, perhaps. I would agree.
There's the matter of accuracy and there's the matter of consistency. So accuracy is 80%, which, as we've mentioned, maybe isn't a big enough jump from 70%. But in 2 of 3 trials, that has to do with consistency and whether the child is actually trying to do the work each time. So it's a little, in 2 of the 3 times that they're given this job to do, given this problem to solve, they have 80% accuracy. The 3rd time, perhaps they're not even trying to do it. So it's more of there's a behavior component again, as well as the accuracy component. Or maybe this is a child with ADHD, and 2 days their attention is pretty good, and on the 3rd day, they just can't seem to address doing the work at all.
So this one is a lot to take in, and we can assume in this case that we have a student with perhaps limited verbal abilities, and that some of this language and support is familiar in some ways to the IEP team.
And this is certainly very specific.
Yes.
As to what, to show what the child is to be doing. The one sort of negative comment I would make on this one has to do with without the presence of non-compliance in 8 of 10 consecutive opportunities. So it really, this is, should it say, instead of that, should it say a certain percentage accuracy in 8 of 10 opportunities? With that one proviso, this is actually a fairly good goal. So just remember, we're looking for both accuracy and consistency.
We have a point here that the question of how many gestural prompts does the student need now? So the baseline perhaps could have a bit more description.
And we might think of choosing one activity to choosing 2 activities as not being a big change, but maybe it is for this child. I mean, this child is a heavily impacted child. And so that might be, in this case, it might be, you'd have to say it's very individual to this child, but it might be a reasonably ambitious goal. You'd have to know a little bit more about the child to make that determination.
We have another input here that the question, is the child able to perform the activities that they are choosing? Which is
it's a good question.
That would definitely be important to verify.
Well, I think with that, we should probably go back to our presentation. Let's go on to tracking and measuring progress. So now that you have goals in the child's IEP, you have to track these goals to show that progress is being made. And this is primarily the way that you determine whether the child's getting appropriate support, is whether or not they're making progress on the goals. So we have to remember that making progress on the goals is more a judgment of the IEP, whether the IEP is working. It's not a judgment of whether the child is doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's really taking account of whether the IEP is properly constituted and the child is receiving the supports they need. So when you're tracking and measuring progress on goals, you have to think about growth over time. So it's hard to say whether progress is being made with just looking at 1 year. You're really looking at how the goals are progressing from year to year. So, for example, the old goal is with teacher prompts, Sue turns in her homework 60% of the time by the due date. And the new goal is that without teacher prompts, Sue turns in homework 80% of the time by the due date. So you're seeing progress, the same skill progress year to year. Another example, with teacher prompts, Sue turns in the homework 60% of the time. Perhaps Susie now turns in her homework 80% of the time, but needs the teacher prompts to do so. So in the new goal, same as last year, 80% without prompts, but now the emphasis is on Sue turning in her homework independently. So you're seeing a growth in the skill and a growth in the independence with which the child can perform it. We mentioned before, when looking at that form of the goal and seeing at the bottom, annual goal wasn't met, you have to think about what happens if goals are not met. You have to have a discussion of why the goal was not being met. Was it too ambitious? Were the services provided not sufficient? Is there another strategy? Is there a different way of teaching the material? Should the child have more time with the resource teacher or with a therapist to work on this goal? And how close did the child come to meeting the goal? If they didn't meet it, there should be some indication of whether it was 20% of the way towards the goal or 80% of the way. And, are there other things going on that are interfering with the child's progress? For example, if the child has academic goals, but their behavior is getting in the way of them being able to work on those goals, then maybe you need to stop and think, oh, perhaps we need a behavior plan so that we can get to the point of being able to work on the academic goals. So what happens with the goal that isn't met? Should it just repeat it in the next IEP? Should you drop it? Either of those things are possible and possibly could be appropriate. You wouldn't want that to happen without a discussion of why that was happening. If the child didn't meet the goal but made 80% of progress towards the goal, well, then it maybe needs to be revised upwards to show more progress in the next year. The baseline would just have to be revised to show where they are now. And, the end goal might be the same, or maybe it's a little bit stronger than previously. But there should be a relationship between these two things, the goal that was met, was not met, and what the goal is next year. It shouldn't just be dropped unless it was decided that it wasn't an appropriate goal in the first place. In that case, you might drop it, or it wasn't attainable in the first place. But normally, you wouldn't just drop goals, whether they're met or not. Sometimes if a goal is met and the child is now on grade level in that particular area, then maybe you don't need to continue a goal. But generally, you want to see next year's goals be building upon the goals from the previous year. And again, in that IEP toolkit that we've mentioned that you can get from our webpage, we have a tracking sheet. And the point of this is simply that if your child's had an IEP for 2, 3, 4 years, or maybe even longer, you should be able to show progress over time And what this is showing is that the present level for this year is at one point, and the goal is where they should be a year from now. So a year from now, what the goal was in the previous year is essentially now the present level. And the goal is something a little bit more ambitious. So you should see this progression from year to year. And this is just a way to show it visually so that you can see whether progress is being made. And if it's not possible to fill this in, it may be that the goals aren't tracking very well year to year. I have sat down with this type of tracking sheet and 3 or 4 years of IEP goals and not be able to make hide nor hair of how I could put it on this form. That's generally because the goals just weren't tracking from year to year. And so that's a problem. So goals, once you have the goals, then you talk about the services. So this is the progression of the IEP. And again, one of the reasons goals are important is in order to determine what services the child needs, you need to know what the goals are. And the services should be based upon what the child needs, the kind of support the child needs in order to meet those goals. So the goals it should be the basis for deciding what services are needed, how much time for each of the goal is needed to work on the goals. The time should be reasonably calculated to be enough to meet the goals. Make sure that the services and the goals match and know who is responsible for meeting the goal. So we're going to give you an example here of goals leading to services. If it's a speech goal, then speech and language therapy should be the service. And the speech and language therapist is the person responsible for it being met. If it's an academic goal, then specialized academic instruction will be the service, and it will be either the classroom teacher or a resource specialist who is responsible for that goal being met. Then, you need to think about how much time does a responsible person need to work on these goals. Finally, the final part of the IEP is the amount of services is going to make a difference in what the placement is, where and under what situation those services can be best provided. It doesn't necessarily mean a location, it means a situation. So they can be provided in general education, either as a push-in where a specialist comes into the classroom to work with your child in the general ed classroom, or a pull-out with the therapist or resource teacher where the child goes to a separate location and works either individually or in a small group with a specialist. Placement can be general education. It can be general education with a pull-out for a small part of the day. It could mean the child's in a special day class for much of the day and only with the general population of kids during lunchtime and recess, perhaps for assemblies or art or music, but all of the academic time might be in a special day class. If there is a higher level of service required, then maybe the child is in a specialized school, maybe even a non-public school. And then placement that is even more restrictive might be something like a residential placement or a home hospital setting. So that's sort of the continuum of placement. And what that placement is going to be largely determined by the level of services that the child needs in order to make progress on their goals. And that really brings us to the conclusion of what we have to present. At this point, it's time to think about what you've learned, whether you think you understand what SMART goals are, whether you need more resources or whether you need more support. And so we would encourage you to look at the materials on our webpage. We would encourage you to give us a call if you want some one-on-one help looking through your IEP, or if you have just questions, or even if you're just feeling very frustrated and you need someone to talk to about it, please do call our helpline and we are happy to chat with you and see if there's something more we can do to support you.